In the endless, sun-scorched kingdom of Nzari, where the wind carries whispers of old legends through the golden dunes, a child named Zenzi is born on a night unlike any other. The sky is set ablaze by the rare skyfire eclipse, a celestial event that turns the moon a deep, fiery red, casting an eerie glow over the desert. The people of Nzari believe this is a powerful omen, a sign from the gods that marks the birth of someone destined for greatness or destruction. No one can tell which fate the child will carry, but fear and awe stir in the hearts of those who witness the crimson moonlight that night. Zenzi's mother, Nia, watches the sky with dread as she holds her newborn daughter close. She's heard the stories passed down for generations. Children born under the skyfire eclipse are said to be touched by something beyond human understanding. Some are said to rise as saviors, leading Nzari into an era of prosperity and peace. Others, however, are believed to bring ruin, their very existence a curse upon the kingdom. Nia refuses to let her daughter be defined by an old prophecy. She looks down at Zenzi's tiny, peaceful face, her heart swelling with love and determination. She knows the people would fear Zenzi, blame her for every drought, every sandstorm, and every misfortune that followed. To protect her child from a world that might turn against her, Nia makes a decision that will shape their lives forever. She keeps the truth hidden. No one outside their home will know Zenzi was born under the blood-red sky. She tells the villagers Zenzi arrived a day after the eclipse, born under a clear, ordinary night. Nia raises her daughter with unwavering love, teaching her kindness, strength, and resilience. She fills their small home with laughter and warmth, sheltering Zenzi from the harshness of the world beyond their walls. The villagers of Nzari know Nia as a strong, hard-working woman who sells beautiful, colourful fabrics in the market. They admire her, but whispers follow her, hushed voices wondering why her husband disappeared on a trade journey and never returned, why her child seems to glow with an unexplainable energy when she laughs. Nia pretends not to hear them, focusing only on keeping Zenzi safe. Zenzi grows into a bright, curious girl. She loves the market's vibrant noise and the smell of spices drifting through the air. She dreams of exploring the world beyond the dunes, but Nia warns her to stay close. The desert doesn't always welcome dreamers, Nia says gently, brushing Zenzi's hair. Zenzi doesn't understand the fear hiding behind her mother's eyes, but she trusts her. For years they live quietly, hidden in plain sight. But the desert has a way of uncovering secrets, no matter how deeply they're buried. Fate, after all, doesn't forget. And Zenzi's birth wasn't just a moment lost to the sands of time. It was the start of a story that Nzari wasn't ready to face yet. The skyfire eclipse wasn't finished with her, not even close. Life seemed peaceful for Zenzi, filled with her mother's warmth and the vibrant hum of the bustling market. Nia's laughter made their small home feel like the safest place in all of Nzari. But peace is a fragile thing, and fate had never forgotten the child born under the skyfire eclipse. One day, everything changed. Nia was invited to the royal palace, a rare honor for someone from their part of the kingdom. She told Zenzi it was nothing to worry about, kissed her forehead, and promised to be home by sunset. But when Nia returned, something was different. Her once bright eyes were dim, her steps slower, and her skin pale and clammy. Zenzi noticed immediately, but Nia brushed off her worry with a tired smile. Days passed, and Nia grew weaker. The woman who had once carried heavy baskets through the market and spun colourful fabrics with ease now struggled to sit up. Zenzi stayed by her side, bringing water and cool cloths, but nothing helped. The local healer came and went, shaking his head, unable to explain what was happening. Nia's body withered, her voice became a faint whisper, and the light in her eyes, the light that made Zenzi feel safe, flickered like a dying flame. One night, under a moonless sky, Nia held Zenzi's hand and whispered her final words. "Be strong, my little star. The world will try to take your light. Don't let it." Zenzi didn't understand what her mother meant. She was too young to realize that those words weren't just comfort. They were a warning. Nia took her last breath, leaving Zenzi alone in a world that suddenly felt much colder. Her father, a brave and respected trader who traveled beyond the desert's edge, wasn't there to comfort her. He had left weeks before, promising to return with treasures and stories from distant lands. Zenzi waited for him, sitting by the door every evening as the sun dipped beneath the dunes. She waited until hope became a heavy ache in her chest. He never came back. With no parents and no home, Zenzi was left in the care of her stepmother, Asha, and her grandmother, Mama Bintu. They arrived soon after Nia's death, dressed in fine silk robes and adorned with gold bracelets that clinked with every movement. Asha was beautiful, with eyes like polished amber and a voice as smooth as honey. She spoke gently to Zenzi, promising to take care of her, to give her a new home and a new family. Mama Bintu, her face weathered and lined like cracked earth, said little, but her gaze lingered on Zenzi for too long, as though she were studying her. At first, they seemed kind. They dressed Zenzi in soft clothes, gave her sweet fruits, and stroked her hair, telling her everything would be all right. Zenzi wanted to believe them. She wanted to feel safe again, but there was something beneath their smiles, something cold and distant. It was in the way Asha's voice sounded too sweet, too rehearsed. It was in the way Mama Bintu watched her, not like a grandmother watching over a child, but like a hawk watching prey. Zenzi didn't understand it yet, but the world she knew had shattered, and the people who claimed to love her weren't there to pick up the pieces. They were waiting to take what was left. At first, Zenzi thought maybe life would get better. Asha and Mama Bintu treated her like a treasured doll, dressing her in the finest silks and colourful robes. They placed gold bangles on her wrists and combed sweet-smelling oils through her hair. Each morning, Asha would smile and tell her how beautiful she looked, how lucky she was to have them now. They paraded her through the market, holding her hand tightly as the villagers admired her new clothes and whispered about how kind Asha was for taking in an orphaned child. Zenzi didn't understand why their hands felt so tight, like they weren't holding her. They were holding on to her, but she told herself she was safe now, that maybe this was her new family. They fed her sweet dates, honeyed milk, and the softest bread. Every meal was a feast, and every day Asha reminded her how lucky she was to have a home, to have someone to care for her. The villagers believed Zenzi was living like a little princess, wrapped in luxury and love. And for a while, Zenzi believed it too. But when the eyes of the villagers weren't watching, everything changed. The warm smiles disappeared, and the sweet words turned sharp. The dresses were taken away, replaced with rough, plain cloth. The honeyed milk was gone, and stale bread took its place. The bracelets and rings that once clinked on her wrists were snatched off without a word. Zenzi woke up one morning to find her soft bed gone, replaced by a thin mat in the corner of the room. Her days were no longer filled with treats and compliments. They were filled with endless chores. Asha's voice, once warm and loving, was now cold and commanding. Zenzi was ordered to scrub the mosaic floors until her hands blistered and ached. The sun burned hot through the open windows, but Asha didn't care. If Zenzi slowed down, she was met with a sharp word or a stinging slap. Mama Bintu watched from the shadows, rarely speaking, but Zenzi could feel her gaze, heavy and unsettling, like she was waiting for something. Zenzi wasn't allowed to eat until everyone else had finished. Some nights, there wasn't anything left for her at all. She wasn't allowed to sit at the table, only to serve. If she cried, Asha would tilt her head and sigh, telling her that tears were useless. "You should be grateful we even took you in," Asha would say, her voice syrupy but empty. "After all, who else would want you now?" The villagers still believed Zenzi was living a life of comfort. When they passed by, Asha would smile sweetly and wave, holding Zenzi's hand tightly like before. Zenzi learned to smile too, even when her stomach ached with hunger and her hands throbbed from scrubbing. She smiled because if she didn't, Asha's grip would tighten so hard it felt like her bones might crack. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a prison made of gold and lies. From the outside, it looked beautiful, a home fit for a princess. But inside, Zenzi was nothing more than a servant. She wasn't their family. She wasn't their treasure. She was their possession. The night the sandstorm came was unlike any other. The wind howled through the desert like an angry spirit, rattling the windows and slamming doors. Sand swept through the air in thick, blinding waves, scraping against the walls of their home like 1,000 tiny claws. Zenzi lay curled on her thin mat, trembling as the storm raged outside. She was used to the desert winds, but this felt different, wilder, angrier, like the desert itself was awake. The house groaned under the weight of the storm. Asha and Mama Bintu were awake too, their voices rising above the howling wind. Zenzi had learned not to eavesdrop. The punishments were too harsh, but something in their urgent whispers made her stomach twist. Quietly, she crept from her corner, staying low and hidden in the shadows. The wind slammed against the walls, making them shake, but Asha's voice cut through it like a knife. "It's awake. The sand has uncovered it. The statue." Mama Bintu's voice, usually low and raspy, was sharper than Zenzi had ever heard. "She's the key. The daughter of the sky fire holds the heart of the jinn. Without her, we can't wake it." Zenzi froze, her heart pounding so loudly she thought they might hear it. The daughter of the sky fire. They were talking about her. They always told her the night of her birth didn't matter, that the eclipse meant nothing. But they had lied. They knew all along. Her mind raced. She wasn't just a burden they tolerated out of kindness. She was something they needed. But for what? Her skin prickled as realization crept over her like ice. They didn't keep her because they loved her. They kept her because she was a tool. Asha's voice lowered, but Zenzi heard the venom in it. "We've waited too long. The statue is awake. The heart is hers to awaken, whether she wants to or not." Zenzi's throat tightened. She didn't understand everything they were saying, but she understood enough. The statue, the heart, the jinn, they weren't protecting her. They were using her. The wind screamed louder, and something outside crashed to the ground with a heavy, thunderous thud. Asha and Mama Bintu ran to the window, peering into the storm. Zenzi crept after them, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Through the swirling sand, barely visible in the dim moonlight, she saw it. A massive, half-buried statue jutting from the earth like a sleeping giant. Its face was worn and broken, but the shape of it was still clear. It wasn't human. Its eyes, though chipped and cracked, seemed to glow faintly, like embers buried beneath ash. Zenzi felt her breath hitch. The statue wasn't just uncovered, it felt like it was waiting for her. Mama Bintu spoke again, her voice low and urgent. "If we wake the jinn, the power will be ours, but only through her." Asha nodded, her expression cold. "She'll do what she's told. She has no one else." Zenzi's chest tightened. They weren't her family. They never were. They didn't love her. They owned her. And now they were ready to take whatever power they believed she held. Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't cry. Not now. She had to get away, had to figure out what they meant and what they planned to do to her. The storm screamed on, but Zenzi barely heard it anymore. The real storm wasn't outside. It was waiting inside the house, wearing the faces of the only family she had left. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't safe. She never had been. The sun was barely rising over the dunes when a sharp knock echoed through the house. Zenzi was scrubbing the floor, her hands raw and blistered from days of endless chores. She flinched at the sound, expecting Asha's angry voice or Mama Bintu's cold stare. But when the door swung open, a man in gleaming robes stood there, a royal messenger. His voice boomed through the house, clear and commanding. "By order of His Majesty, the Sultan of Nzari, Zenzi, daughter of Nia, is invited to the palace to honor her mother's memory." Zenzi's heart leapt. Her mother's memory. After all this time, a flicker of hope sparked in her chest. Maybe the Sultan had heard of Nia's kindness, her strength. Maybe he wanted to reward Zenzi for the life her mother had built, despite all the hardship. For a moment, she imagined being free from Asha and Mama Bintu, living in the palace surrounded by silk and gold. Mama Bintu stepped forward. Before Zenzi could speak, her face twisted into an eager smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said quickly. Zenzi would be honored. Her voice dripped with fake sweetness, the kind she only used when others were watching. Zenzi's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The messenger bowed and left, his golden robes billowing behind him. As soon as the door closed, Mama Bintu's smile disappeared. She turned to Asha, her voice low and urgent. "It's happening. Baraka knows." Zenzi froze. Baraka. She had heard the name before. The Sultan's sorcerer. The villagers whispered about him in hushed tones. Some said he could summon sandstorms with a wave of his hand. Others claimed he could steal a man's shadow, leaving him to wander aimlessly, hollow and lost. Mama Bintu's voice lowered, but Zenzi pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. "Baraka says the girl's blood can wake the golden djinn. He believes she holds the key to binding it." Zenzi's heart pounded in her ears. The golden djinn. She had heard the stories. An ancient, powerful being buried beneath the desert long ago. It was said to grant unlimited power to whoever woke it first. Kings, warlords, even sorcerers had searched for it, but none had ever returned. "She's more valuable than we thought," Mama Bintu hissed. "The Sultan will give us anything once Baraka binds the djinn. Wealth, power, whatever we want." Asha's voice, once warm and sweet, was now cold and sharp. "And if she doesn't survive the binding?" Mama Bintu scoffed. "Then she dies. The djinn will still wake. It only needs her blood. She's a small price to pay for what we'll gain." Zenzi's breath caught in her throat. Her chest felt tight, like the air had been ripped from her lungs. They didn't want her to go to the palace to honor her mother. They were sending her to die. Her mind raced. She thought of her mother's warm smile, her father's promise to return, the nights she spent dreaming of freedom. It had all been a lie. Asha and Mama Bintu had never cared about her. They had only kept her alive because they needed her for this moment. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry. Not now. She couldn't let them see her break. The palace wasn't a place of honor. It was a trap. And if Zenzi didn't find a way to escape, she wouldn't live to see another sunrise. The palace was more beautiful than Zenzi had ever imagined. Towering arches of polished marble stretched high above her. Glittering lanterns cast warm, dancing light across the walls, and silk banners in vibrant reds and golds swayed gently from the ceiling. The air smelled of sweet jasmine and roasted almonds, and music filled the grand hall. People laughed and danced, dressed in clothes more colourful and rich than anything Zenzi had ever seen. But her heart was too heavy to enjoy it. Her stepmother's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't here to honour her mother. She was here to awaken the golden djinn. And once she did, she wouldn't be leaving the palace alive. She forced a smile when the nobles glanced her way, pretending to enjoy the feast, but her stomach twisted in knots. Asha and Mama Bintu stood close by, their eyes never leaving her. They didn't smile or speak. They only watched, waiting for Baraka. Then, in the middle of the celebration, the performers arrived. They spilled into the hall in a burst of colour and sound. Dancers, fire-breathers, and masked acrobats spinning through the air. The crowd cheered and clapped, and for a moment, even Zenzi forgot her fear. One performer moved differently than the rest. His mask was deep blue, decorated with silver stars. He didn't dance like the others. He weaved through the crowd like a shadow, moving closer to Zenzi. When he passed by her, his hand brushed her arm, and he slipped a folded scrap of parchment into her hand. She stared after him, confused, but he was already gone, blending into the swirling crowd, heart racing. She unfolded the note under the table. Only 4 words were scrawled in hurried, messy ink. "They want your soul." Her breath caught in her throat. Before she could process the words, the masked performer appeared again, this time right beside her. He moved so fast, no one noticed. He leaned in close, his voice low but urgent. "Listen carefully," he said. "You're not here to wake the djinn. You're here to die. Baraka doesn't want your power. He wants your soul to bind the djinn to him." Zenzi's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The performer hesitated. "My name is Kamari. I knew your mother." Zenzi's heart pounded harder. "You knew my mother?" Kamari nodded. She wasn't just a weaver or a merchant's wife. She was part of an ancient order, the guardians of the heart. They protected the jinn's heart for centuries, keeping it hidden from people like Baraka, people who crave power. He glanced around, lowering his voice even more. Your mother died to protect you because you're the last of that bloodline. You're the only one who can awaken the jinn, or stop it from ever waking again. Zenzi's mind spun. Her mother had never mentioned any of this. She had been warm and kind, not a warrior, not a protector, but deep down, Zenzi felt something stir inside her, a memory. Nia's final words echoed in her mind. Be strong, my little star. The world will try to take your light. Don't let it. Tears burned in her eyes, but she swallowed them down. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kamari's eyes softened beneath his mask. Because your mother once saved me, and now I'll save you. Before Zenzi could ask more, he disappeared back into the crowd, leaving only his words behind. Her hands trembled. The world she thought she knew had shattered again. Her mother wasn't just a weaver, she was a protector, a hero. And Zenzi wasn't just a forgotten orphan. She was the last of something ancient and powerful. The Sultan's sorcerer wasn't after her power. He was after her very soul. And now Zenzi knew the truth. She wasn't going to die in this palace. She was going to fight. Zenzi's heart hammered in her chest as the grand feast continued around her. Laughter and music filled the air, but it all felt distant, like a dream she couldn't wake from. Her mind spun with Kamari's warning. They don't want your power. They want your soul. She wanted to run, but Mama Bintu's sharp eyes stayed on her, and Asha's tight grip on her wrist made sure she wouldn't dare. When the feast began to slow, and the guests' laughter turned to lazy murmurs, a palace guard appeared at Asha's side. He spoke in a low voice, and Asha nodded, her eyes flicking to Zenzi. It's time, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Come, my dear, the Sultan has prepared something special for you. Zenzi didn't move. Her body felt frozen. Mama Bintu leaned in close, her voice a low hiss in Zenzi's ear. Don't embarrass us now. You wouldn't want the Sultan to think you're ungrateful. Her nails dug into Zenzi's arm, hard enough to hurt. Zenzi swallowed the fear rising in her throat and forced her legs to move. Asha and Mama Bintu led her through a side door, away from the bright lights and cheering guests. The further they walked, the colder the air felt. The silk and gold of the palace faded into dark stone walls, lit only by flickering torches. Finally, they stopped before a massive door, carved with strange symbols Zenzi didn't recognize. Asha pushed it open and Zenzi stepped inside. Her breath caught in her throat. The chamber was enormous, but the first thing she noticed wasn't the size, it was the statues. They lined the walls, towering and golden. Each one was a person, frozen in place, their faces twisted in terror. Some had their hands raised, as if shielding themselves from something. Others looked like they had been running when they turned to gold. Their eyes, though lifeless, seemed to stare straight into her soul. Zenzi took a shaky step back, but Mama Bintu and Asha blocked the door. What is this place? Zenzi's voice trembled. Asha's smile was gone now. Her eyes were cold and empty. The ones who came before you. Zenzi's heart dropped. Before me? Mama Bintu's voice was low and cruel. You're not the first child. The sorcerer Baraka has tried to awaken the golden jinn before. These statues, they were the others. The ones who failed. Zenzi's throat tightened. Failed? Asha stepped closer, her voice calm but hollow. We made a deal. Your life, in exchange for everything we ever wanted. Wealth, power, eternal youth. Baraka promised it all. Once you wake the jinn. Zenzi stared at them, her chest tightening like a rope was pulling around it. You promised my life? Her voice cracked. Mama Bintu didn't even flinch. You were never ours to keep. You were born for this, Zenzi. Your mother tried to hide you, but fate always wins. Tears burned in Zenzi's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Her mother had died protecting her from this. Her father had vanished trying to save her. And these women, the ones who were supposed to care for her, had betrayed her all along. Asha stepped closer, tilting her head. It's nothing personal, child. One life for eternal youth, that's a fair trade. Zenzi's stomach twisted. The statues weren't decorations. They were people. People who had dreams, Families, lives, people who trusted the wrong hands, just like she had. The weight of it crashed over her like a wave. She wasn't special to them. She was never their daughter. She was a sacrifice. Her heart pounded, rage bubbling beneath her fear. They thought she was weak. They thought she would accept this. They were wrong. Zenzi wasn't going to be another golden statue on the wall. The air in the chamber grew heavy, thick with the smell of burning incense, and something colder, something unnatural. Zenzi's heart raced as the doors groaned open once more. Baraka entered, his long robes trailing behind him like a shadow. His eyes, dark and hollow, settled on her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "Finally," he murmured, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The daughter of the Skyfire, at last." Zenzi wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Asha and Mama Bintu stood behind Baraka, their faces twisted with anticipation. They weren't afraid. They wanted this. They wanted her to die. Baraka raised his staff, carved from something that looked like bone, and began to chant. The torches flickered wildly, the flames bending toward him, as if drawn by his words. The ground trembled beneath Zenzi's feet. The golden statues lining the walls seemed to groan. Their frozen mouths parted in silent screams. Zenzi squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to be another lifeless statue, another forgotten soul. Then, a crack of thunder split the sky outside. The ground shook so hard that the walls seemed to ripple. Zenzi gasped, her eyes flying open just as the light from the torches snuffed out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, but only for a moment. A flash of brilliant, blinding light erupted from the sky, flooding the chamber through the high, narrow windows. It wasn't sunlight. It was something stronger, hotter. Zenzi recognized it instantly. The Skyfire eclipse. The same eclipse from the day she was born had returned. Before Zenzi could process what was happening, a searing warmth exploded from within her chest. Light poured from her skin, golden and radiant, brighter than the sun. It didn't burn. It felt like she had been carrying this fire inside her all along, and now it was finally free. Baraka staggered backward, shielding his eyes. "What? What is this?" he snarled. Zenzi's breath came in short, shaking gasps. But the fear that had gripped her moments ago was gone. She wasn't afraid anymore. The light filled her, making her feel stronger than she ever had before. The ground rumbled again, louder this time. The statues lining the walls began to crack and crumble, golden dust raining down. And then, from the center of the room, the floor split open. A gust of hot wind blasted through the chamber as a massive figure rose from the earth. Its body shimmered like molten sand, its eyes blazing like twin suns. It was the Jinn, the golden Jinn. Baraka raised his staff, but the Jinn ignored him. Its burning gaze fell on Zenzi, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, to everyone's shock, the Jinn lowered its head. "Daughter of the flame," it rumbled, its voice echoing like 1,000 desert winds. "We have waited for you." Zenzi's eyes widened. Her voice trembled. You're not here to kill me?" The Jinn lifted its head, towering over Baraka. "You were never meant to be a sacrifice," it said. "You are the flame that commands the storm, the last of your mother's bloodline, the one destined to hold my power." Baraka's face twisted in rage. "No! She belongs to me!" The Jinn turned towards him slowly. Its eyes burned brighter. "No," it said, its voice like a rolling wave of fire. "She belongs to no one." And in that moment, Zenzi knew. She wasn't the key to the Jinn's chains. She was the one meant to set it free. The room was filled with golden light, warm and powerful, pouring from Zenzi's very skin. The Jinn stood behind her, a towering force of fire and wind, its blazing eyes fixed on the trembling figures of Asha and Mama Bintu, the two women who had once held their heads high with pride and cruelty, now cowered on the floor, their faces pale with terror. Mama Bintu's voice broke first, shaking and desperate. "Zenzi, my sweet girl, we didn't mean for this. We only wanted a better life. Please forgive us." Asha nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. "We were fools, Zenzi. We trusted the sorcerer. He lied to us. We never meant to hurt you. You're like a daughter to me. Please help us." Zenzi stared at them, her heart twisting painfully. Their words were empty now, their lies laid bare. They hadn't seen her as a daughter. They had seen her as a key to their own greed. They had sold her life to Baraka for gold and eternal youth. But still, looking at them now, broken, scared and powerless, they weren't monsters. They were just people who had let their desires consume them. The jinn's voice rumbled through the chamber, low and powerful. They betrayed you. They offered your soul to darkness. They would have watched you die. Now, the choice is yours, daughter of the flame. Punish them or release them from their greed. Zenzi's throat tightened. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. She wanted to hate them. She wanted to scream, to let her pain fuel her rage. But deep down, she knew hatred wouldn't undo the past. It wouldn't bring back her mother or her father. It wouldn't erase the nights she spent scrubbing floors while they laughed over honeyed milk. It wouldn't heal her heart. Tears burned in her eyes as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. I don't want revenge, she said softly. I don't want to become like them, like Baraka. I just want this to end. She looked at the jinn, her eyes shining with determination. Break whatever hold the sorcerer has on them. Free them from this greed, from this curse. Let them remember who they used to be before they became this. The jinn's fiery gaze softened, and it nodded. So it shall be. It raised one massive, molten hand and flicked its wrist. A burst of golden flame erupted, swirling around Asha and Mama Bintu. The women screamed, but the fire didn't burn them. It wrapped around them like a ribbon of light, pulling something dark and shadowy from their bodies, something twisted and foul. The shadows writhed, then vanished into smoke. The flames died down, leaving the women gasping on the floor. Their faces looked different now, older, worn, and hollow. The false youth the sorcerer had promised them was gone, leaving only the truth. Mama Bintu looked up at Zenzi, her voice weak. I'm so sorry. Zenzi swallowed hard, her tears falling freely now. I know. A sudden, violent tremor shook the chamber. The walls groaned and cracked, chunks of stone crashing to the floor. The jinn turned, its voice thunderous. The sorcerer's magic dies with him. This place will not stand. Across the room, Baraka stumbled into view, his once powerful figure now hunched and broken. His eyes burned with fury. No! This isn't over! He spat, raising his staff, but the staff cracked in his hands, splitting in two. His magic was gone. The jinn loomed over him. Your time is done! With a final, deafening roar, the palace began to collapse. Stone and fire rained from the ceiling. Baraka screamed as the floor crumbled beneath him, swallowing him into the depths. His voice was silenced forever. Zenzi didn't look back. The jinn wrapped a protective arm of golden flame around her, guiding her through the falling rubble. She didn't stop running until the cool night air hit her face, and the palace was nothing but smoke and ruin behind her. The nightmare was over. The betrayal had ended, and Zenzi, the daughter of the flame, was finally free. The sun rose slowly over the ruins of the palace, painting the desert sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The air was still thick with smoke, but the flames had died, leaving only ashes and silence. Zenzi stood at the edge of the wreckage, her heart heavy, yet strangely light. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a sacrifice. She was free. The Sultan himself arrived not long after the dust settled. His royal guards parted the crowd that had gathered, whispering and pointing at Zenzi as if she were a miracle, and perhaps she was. The stories had already begun to spread, tales of a girl who glowed with fire, who commanded a jinn, who destroyed the dark sorcerer and brought the palace to its knees. The Sultan approached Zenzi, his robes trailing in the sand. His eyes, once distant and cold, now held something else. Respect. You saved us all, he said, his voice steady, but full of awe. You could have taken revenge. You could have claimed the power for yourself, but you didn't. You chose mercy. Zenzi didn't know what to say. She wasn't a hero. She had just done what felt right. The Sultan studied her for a moment longer, then spoke loud enough for all to hear. Nzari needs a protector, someone strong, but kind, someone who understands pain, but chooses hope. I name Zenzi, daughter of the flame, the protector of Nzari. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a wave. Zenzi's eyes widened in shock. Protector. She had spent her whole life feeling powerless. Now, they were looking at her like she was their savior. Before she could find her voice, she noticed someone moving through the crowd. A figure, tall and familiar, stepped forward. He pulled off his mask, the mask of the palace performer who had warned her. Kamari? Zenzi's voice trembled. He smiled, his eyes warm and filled with something that felt like home. You knew my name, but you didn't know who I was. I'm not just a performer. I'm the son of the caravan your father traveled with, the one that disappeared. My father was his closest friend. When the caravan was attacked, my father sent me away to keep me safe. I've been searching for you ever since. Zenzi's breath caught. Her father's caravan. She had thought they were all gone. Yet here Kamari stood, the last piece of her lost family. You're my family, she whispered. Kamari nodded. Yes, and I'm not going anywhere. Tears filled Zenzi's eyes, but they weren't from sadness this time. For so long, she had felt alone, like a forgotten ember in the desert. But now she wasn't alone. She had a home, she had a family, and she had a kingdom that believed in her. The people of Nzari began chanting her name, their voices ringing through the desert air. But it wasn't just her name anymore. They gave her a new one that would echo through the sands for generations to come. Queen of fire and light. Zenzi lifted her head, her heart burning with new purpose. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't a sacrifice. She wasn't a girl hidden in the shadows anymore. She was a queen,